Right now, as you watch this, three separate conflicts are escalating across three continents: Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East. Most people see these as separate issues. Here's a territorial dispute. There's a diplomatic crisis, the background noise of a busy life. But military strategists see something different. They see a single global system under stress. They see interconnected triggers where pulling one thread unravels the others. And they see a very specific clock held by physicists and nuclear scientists that stands closer to midnight than at any other time in human history. 89 seconds. This is not intended to spread fear. This is pattern recognition. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what these patterns are, why analysts are more worried than they have been since 1962, and most importantly, what all of this means for you, for your city, for your building, if one of these triggers is triggered. This is the Urban Decay Laboratory. Today, we analyze what foreign policy experts are calling the most dangerous geopolitical alignment seen in over 60 years. We are not doing this through the lens of politics or ideology. We are not here to say who is right and who is wrong. We are doing this through the lens of infrastructure, logistics, and the reality of survival. Because what most people miss is this: regardless of which side you support, regardless of which conflict you think is right or wrong, the physics of global devastation doesn't care about your opinions. Whether you vote left or right, supply chains break down the same way. Cities collapse the same way, regardless of which flag is flying. And the first 72 hours of a global crisis look quite similar, regardless of whether you live in New York, Berlin, Tokyo, or Sao Paulo. We will address three active fronts. We will explain how they are interconnected in ways not covered in most news reports. And then we will map out exactly what a multi-front global conflict would look like for someone living in a large metropolitan area far from any active conflict zone. This is not Hollywood. There's no exaggeration. There's no political agenda. Just the fundamental reality. Let's start with the front that dominates the headlines of the Western press: the conflict in Eastern Europe. The war in Ukraine has lasted longer than the entire Soviet Union campaign in World War II. Think about it for a moment. From the invasion in June 1941 to the fall of Berlin in May 1945, the Soviet Union fought Nazi Germany for 3 years and 11 months. The current conflict has exceeded that time frame. This isn't a political statement, it's a calendar fact. And it's not just the length that fundamentally distinguishes this conflict from past regional wars. It's its proximity to the NATO alliance border.
For those unfamiliar, NATO is a mutual defense alliance of 32 countries. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty states that an attack on one member state is considered an attack on all member states. This is the principle that has prevented direct great power conflict in Europe for almost 80 years. And right now, this principle is being tested every day. In 2025, NATO warplanes carried out more than 570 interception missions against Russian aircraft near Alliance airspace. That's not a typo. 570 missions. That's almost 3 times more than just 2 years ago. These aren't headlines you see on the evening news. These are daily operations that are so routine that their news value hardly even becomes apparent. However, from an infrastructure perspective, and from the point of view this channel prioritizes, what's important is this. First, the European energy grid. For decades, Europe obtained approximately 40% of its natural gas from Russian pipelines. This supply relationship is now fundamentally broken. European countries have scrambled to find alternative sources. Liquefied natural gas from the United States and Qatar, new pipeline connections to North Africa, accelerated use of renewable energy. But adapting the energy infrastructure of an entire continent is not a one-year project. It's a decade-long transformation taking place in crisis mode. Second, electricity connections between European countries have become strategic assets rather than just infrastructure. The electricity grid has become a geopolitical issue. Third, and this connects directly to our previous sections, physical infrastructure has become a target that didn't exist in previous European conflicts. Pipelines, subsea cables, substations, data centers. The Nord Stream pipeline explosions demonstrated that infrastructure thousands of kilometers away from any front line is now vulnerable to deliberate attacks. Let me give you a very specific and recent example. January 2026, just a few weeks ago, Berlin, the capital of Germany, Europe's largest economy, experienced its longest power outage since 1945. 4 days. 40,000 households were without electricity. The reason? It wasn't a storm. It wasn't an equipment failure. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate sabotage. Allegedly, a small group of just 3 people possessing knowledge of infrastructure vulnerabilities targeted specific points in the electricity distribution system. 3 people. A major European capital was left in the dark for 4 days. This is what modern conflict looks like before it escalates into a declared war. Hybrid operations, reasonable denial, infrastructure as a battlefield. And here's the part that concerns you personally, wherever you are. The tactics tried in Europe are not geographically limited. They are methodologically transferable. What works in Berlin might work in Chicago. What devastated Munich might devastate Melbourne. The guidelines being written now are about infrastructure vulnerabilities that exist in every developed country.
The Doomsday Clock, maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since 1947 and updated annually based on assessments by nuclear scientists and security experts, currently stands at 89 seconds to midnight. In this metaphor, midnight represents a global catastrophe. 89 seconds is the closest point ever. Closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, closer than the Berlin Crisis, closer than any point in the entire Cold War. This is not a sensationalist approach. This is the thoughtful assessment of people who have spent their entire careers analyzing precisely these scenarios. Now I want you to turn your attention 12,000 kilometers east, from Eastern Europe to the waters between mainland China and the island of Taiwan. Military planners in Washington, Beijing, Tokyo, and Canberra have been running scenarios here for decades. Not because war is inevitable, not because anyone wants conflict, but the consequences of a miscalculation here would be unlike anything the modern global economy has ever experienced. Let me explain why with a single statistic. Taiwan produces more than 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. These aren't just computer chips. These are the microprocessors in your smartphone, the control units in your car's engine management system, the chips in your medical devices, your home appliances, your bank's servers, your hospital's equipment. Modern civilization runs on silicon, and the most advanced silicon comes from a small island in the Western Pacific. This isn't about geopolitical or historical territorial claims, but those are important to those involved. From an infrastructure standpoint, this is about a single point of failure in the global technology supply chain. A disruption in Taiwan's semiconductor industry wouldn't be a local event. It would spread to every supply chain on the planet within weeks, not months. Within weeks. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, makes chips for Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, and dozens of other companies whose products you use every day. There's no backup. There's no alternative of equivalent scale and sophistication. Manufacturing plants under construction in Arizona and Germany won't reach production capacity for years. And even then, they won't be able to match Taiwan's current production. This is the context for understanding military activity in the Taiwan Strait. China has conducted numerous siege exercises around Taiwan in recent years. These are large-scale military exercises involving naval vessels, aircraft, and missile forces, simulating a blockade or invasion scenario. In military planning terminology, these are rehearsals. They are practical exercises conducted to verify logistics, test coordination, and demonstrate capability.
The capacity exists. The planning exists. The question analysts are debating is not whether China will attempt to seize Taiwan. The question is intent and timing. The year 2027 keeps appearing in strategic assessments. Some analysts call this the Davidson window, named after former U.S. Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral Philip Davidson. Davidson testified before Congress that China could take action against Taiwan by 2027. Regardless of whether this timeline is accurate, its inclusion in planning documents is shaping the behavior of all parties. Now, even if you've never given Taiwan any thought in your life, let me explain why it's important for your daily life. Any conflict in the Taiwan Strait wouldn't stay confined to Taiwan Strait. Shipping routes through the South China Sea carry about 1/3 of global maritime trade. This isn't just goods from China. This means goods moving between every Asian economy and every market in the world. A disruption of these routes, even for weeks, let alone months, would cause shortages that would trigger chain reactions across entire retail and manufacturing sectors simultaneously. You wouldn't see warships on your television. You'd see empty shelves in your stores. Car dealerships would be out of stock. Electronics would be in short supply. Order delays would occur. This situation would continue indefinitely. As shortages set in, you would see a sudden increase in the prices of available goods. And there's another secondary effect that few people talk about. The Pacific Front and the European Front are not separate scenarios. They are interconnected points of tension on a single global system. A crisis in one region strains the response capacity of another region. The United States cannot allocate its entire naval force to Eastern Europe if needed in the Western Pacific, or to Eastern Europe if needed in the Western Pacific. This isn't theory. This is why alliances exist. And this is also why successive conflicts are qualitatively different from isolated conflicts. Two simultaneous crises aren't twice as dangerous as one crisis. They are exponentially more dangerous because response capacity is not aggregated. The third front, the oldest point of tension on the list, and somehow still the most urgently unstable. In June 2025, an event occurred that received less attention than it deserved in many parts of the world. A 12-day military conflict unfolded between Israel and Iran. This wasn't a border clash, nor was it a proxy war waged through intermediaries. This involved direct attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities. It involved retaliatory missile launches against Israeli territory. It involved the largest regional military mobilization seen in decades. American assets were repositioned. Statements were issued from Russia. For 12 days, the Middle East came closer to a regional war than it had since 1973.
The ceasefire was reached. Tensions eased from their peak. But here's the critical point. The root causes of the friction between Israel and Iran remain completely unresolved. The nuclear issue, proxy networks, regional competition for influence. None of this has been resolved. The ceasefire halted military exchanges, but it didn't address the conditions that gave rise to them. So why is this important for infrastructure analysis? The Middle East controls roughly 1/3 of global oil production and a significant portion of global natural gas reserves. Energy still fuels the global economy. Electric vehicles are on the rise. Renewable energy is expanding. But right now, today, petroleum products fuel the ships that carry your goods, the trucks that deliver your packages, the planes that carry cargo, and the production processes of the fertilizers that grow your food. The Strait of Hormuz is a 34-kilometer-wide bottleneck at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. About 20% of the world's oil passes through this strait every day. 20% every day. If the conflict escalates to the point where the strait becomes a disputed territory, shipping traffic becomes dangerous, and insurance companies refuse to insure ships passing through, energy prices skyrocket within hours. Not days, within hours. This isn't speculation. We have historical data. The 1973, 1979, and 2008 oil shocks clearly demonstrated how quickly energy price increases spread to every other sector of the economy. Transportation costs rise because vehicles run on fuel. Production costs rise because factories run on energy. Food prices rise because fertilizers are derived from oil, and transportation moves everything from the farm to the store. For someone living in a city far from these battlefields, the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian missiles, and Israeli jets, the Middle East front is actually the first front that will affect your daily life. Not through military action, but through economic transmission. Energy prices change your bills. Fuel prices change your transportation costs. Commodity prices change your grocery spending. A war you'll never see, a conflict 10,000 kilometers away, can show up in your household budget within weeks. This is where the analysis gets really unsettling, and I want you to stay with me, because this is the part that is never explained in most news reports. These three fronts, Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, are not independent variables. They are interconnected systems. What happens on one affects the others, not through conspiracy, but through direct strategic logic. Think of this from the perspective of a strategic actor.
If you are Russia, and you see the U.S. focusing its attention and military resources on the Pacific because of the Taiwan crisis, what does that mean for the European front? It means a reduction in NATO's capacity to intervene. It can also mean opportunity. If you are China, and you see U.S. resources being concentrated on European defense, due to the escalation of the NATO-Russia conflict, what does that mean for the Pacific? It means a potential decrease in American capacity to reinforce Taiwan. If you are Iran and you see global attention focused on Europe and Asia,
What does that mean for regional freedom of movement in the Middle East? Less control, more room for maneuver. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is game theory. It's the basic logic of strategic behavior that every military academy knows. What I teach is something every foreign ministry understands. The most dangerous scenario isn't a one-front conflict that the global system can barely absorb but probably manage. The most dangerous scenario is a multi-front, simultaneous crisis that overwhelms the response capacity of the great powers. And there's one more variable that makes 2026 particularly worrying. On February 5th, 2026, just a few weeks from now, the New START Treaty expires. This is the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. It limited each country's deployed strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550 and established verification mechanisms so that both sides could confirm the other's compliance. With the expiration of the treaty, those limits disappear. Verification disappears. For the first time since the 1970s, there is no binding agreement governing the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report, interstate armed conflict is among the top 5 global risks for 2026. This is the consensus of over 1,500 global risk experts from academia, government, and the private sector. So let's get practical. This is the Urban Collapse Lab. We're not doing abstract theory. We're dealing with the reality of infrastructure. What would the first 72 hours of a multi-front global conflict look like for someone living in a large metropolis? Not in a war zone, not near any front, just in a normal city. 0 to 4 a.m. The news comes in. If it happens during trading hours, markets react before you fully process the headline. Stock indices fall. Circuit breakers may halt trading. Commodity futures, especially oil, natural gas, and agricultural products, rise. By the time you read the headline and consider its implications, the market has already priced in the initial wave of reaction.
4 to 12 a.m. Panic buying begins. Queues at gas stations form within hours, not days. And here's an important nuance. This isn't irrational behavior. It's a rational response to uncertain supply chains. People aren't stupid. They watch the news. They understand that fuel comes from somewhere, often very far away, through supply chains that can be disrupted. The same is true in supermarkets. Bottled water, canned goods, batteries, medicines, first aid supplies. Scarcity psychology moves faster than scarcity logistics. Products run out because enough people expect them to. 12 to 24 hours. Government announcements. Emergency measures. Depending on the scale of the conflict, you might see travel restrictions, especially for international flights. Financial controls might be announced. Communication might break down because everyone wants to check on their family, read the news, and browse social media all at once. 24 to 48 hours. The reality of the supply chain emerges. Modern retail operates with just-in-time inventory. There is no back warehouse full of reserve stock. What you see on the shelves is, in most cases, what's available. Products with foreign-sourced components face uncertain resupply times. As shortages become apparent, prices of available goods rise. 48 to 72 hours. The initial shock stabilizes, transforming into a new business reality. Either the crisis subsides and systems begin to return to normal, or it prolongs and medium-term challenges emerge. Persistently high prices, selective shortages, months of economic adjustments. Here's the critical point. Most people focus on dramatic scenarios, missiles, war, destruction. But for the overwhelming majority of the global population, even in a serious multi-front conflict, the experience would not be physical danger. It would be economic disruption. Expensive gasoline, intermittent shortages, high prices, career uncertainty. These mundane realities would affect billions of people who wouldn't even hear a single gunshot. The vulnerability of any metropolitan area to global conflict is a function of its dependencies. How much of your food is locally produced? How much is imported? How much of your energy is produced domestically? And how much is sourced internationally? How much of your economy is dependent on global supply chains? Modern cities are optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Just-in-time supply chains minimize warehousing costs, but also minimize buffer capacity. Globalized sourcing finds the cheapest producer, but also creates the longest supply lines. The same forces that make cities prosperous in peacetime make them vulnerable in times of crisis.
6 things you can do today. Legal, practical, immediate. 1. Create a 2-week supply buffer. Not a doomsday bunker, just 2 weeks' worth of essentials. Water, 1 gallon per person per day. That's 14 gallons per person. Non-perishable food, medications you take regularly. Basic hygiene products. Materials, initial cost $150 to $300. 2. Create a cash buffer. Digital payments require electricity, internet connection, and functioning banking systems. A small cash reserve at home will cover any gaps that arise if any of these systems fail. Physical cash for 2 weeks of essential expenses. 3rd, create a communication plan. How will you communicate with your family members if cell phone networks are congested? Printed phone numbers of important people. A person out of the area who can relay messages. Agreed meeting points. A 5-minute family call now will prevent confusion during an actual event. 4th, create power alternatives. Flashlights with backup batteries. A battery-powered or hand-cranked radio, essential when there is no internet. A portable phone charger. A small generator if you have the capacity. These are practical tools for any prolonged disruption. 5th, know your sources of information. Which broadcasting stations does your government use for emergency alerts? Download offline maps of your area. Bookmark key websites for local emergency management. The only information you can rely on when systems fail is the information you already have. 6th, build community connections. Do you know your neighbors? In any urban disruption scenario, community cooperation is superior to individual isolation. You don't need a formal group. You just need to not be a stranger when something happens. We started with 3 fronts: Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East. We mapped the connections that make simultaneous crises more likely and more dangerous.
We examined what the first 72 hours looked like, far from any war zone. And we outlined 6 steps that apply no matter which scenario occurs. The purpose of this video is not to scare you. Inactive anxiety is useless. The goal is conscious preparation. To understand the situation well enough to take reasonable precautions, which, if the unlikely were to happen, could be cost-effective but extremely important. The probability of any of the scenarios we discussed occurring is low, but at some point, the probability of a disruption for some reason is not low at all. Preparation is not paranoia. It's about prudently acknowledging that systems are complex, the world is uncertain, and individual resilience reduces collective tension. In the next section, we'll delve deeper into a topic briefly touched upon in this video: energy. Not the geopolitics of oil, it's the electrical infrastructure, the grid itself, how it works, why it's vulnerable, what happens when it becomes a strategic target. It's not theoretical, it's already happening, and it's much closer than you think. Tell me in the comments, which of these 3 fronts are you following most closely? And have you ever considered what your city's specific vulnerabilities might be? This is the Urban Collapse Lab. Systems collapse, information doesn't.